By the late 1960s, the world felt like it was spinning off its axis. The headlines were darker, sharper, and more relentless than anything rock musicians had lived through before. The Vietnam War wasn't just a distant conflict, it was a shadow stretching across an entire generation. Nightly broadcasts showed things that felt too brutal to understand. The streets of America and Europe were boiling with protests, clashes, and fear. And then came the Manson murders, shattering whatever innocence the counterculture still believed it had. For most bands, this chaos existed outside the studio. For the Rolling Stones, it seeped into it. Their music had always carried a bit of danger, but this was different. The world's violence was beginning to mirror their own internal turbulence. Mick was becoming more ambitious, Keith more distrustful, and the band's direction more uncertain. Everywhere the Stones turned, something felt unstable: friendships, relationships, the culture around them. Even the promise of peace and love had started to feel like a broken joke. Fans danced, politicians lied, and society trembled. It was as if everyone felt something coming, but no one could name it. Keith later said that this sense of global unease built up inside him like static electricity. He carried it from city to city, show to show, hotel to hotel. And when he finally returned home and picked up a guitar, that energy didn't disappear. It snapped into place. Something was about to be born. But it needed a spark. Before we continue, if you love the stories of Mick Jagger and Rolling Stones and want to help keep his legacy alive, subscribe to this channel. Keith Richards always insisted that Gimme Shelter didn't come from creativity, it came from instinct, from fear, from the feeling of being hunted by something invisible. And the night that riff emerged is the kind of story that sounds too cinematic to be real, yet it was exactly how Keith described it. He was alone, waiting for Mick, who was off filming Performance. It was late, the sky was heavy, and a thunderstorm was rolling in with a kind of violence that made the windows shake. Keith watched from the window as people rushed through the streets, covering their heads with newspapers and jackets, looking for any doorway, any place to hide. One flash of lightning lit up the whole street, and Keith felt something hit him, a sense that the world wasn't just dealing with weather, it was dealing with warning. He grabbed his guitar. Not to write a song, but to calm the feeling in his chest. But instead of relief, a riff came out sharp, haunting, almost uneasy. It didn't feel designed, it felt delivered. The storm outside crashed, and the riff answered it like an echo. Keith later said, "It was like watching trouble walk through the door. The notes felt like footsteps. The rhythm felt like breath. And as the storm kept growing, so did the song." It was as if the world outside was shaping the melody in real time. But the riff alone wasn't enough. To become what it needed to be, the song required something far more dangerous. The Rolling Stones were built on a strange kind of electricity, the kind that sparks brilliance and conflict at the same time. And in 1969, Mick and Keith were entering one of the most turbulent phases of their partnership. Their creative bond had always depended on tension, but now that tension was beginning to feel like a fault line. Mick was becoming increasingly drawn to film, fashion, and new artistic worlds, while Keith clung tightly to the raw rock and roll spirit that had defined the band from the start. This wasn't simple disagreement. It was a quiet tug of war over the band's soul. And in the middle of it, Gimme Shelter was forming like a storm cloud. Keith didn't have Mick by his side when the riff came to life, and that absence created a strange emotional undertone. Almost like the song was Keith's attempt to pull the band back into something darker, heavier, more honest. When Mick finally heard the riff, he immediately understood its weight. He felt the danger inside it. But instead of resisting, he leaned in. The tension between them didn't weaken the music, it fed it. Mick's lyrics carried anxiety, urgency, and a sense of looming catastrophe, exactly the emotions Keith had channeled through the guitar. This push and pull created a perfect storm of creativity, a moment where friction became fuel. And yet, even with Mick's intensity added to the mix, the song was missing its most haunting element. Something or someone needed to break it open. Ask anyone who was in the studio that night, and they'll tell you the same thing. No one expected Gimme Shelter to change the moment Merry Clayton walked through the door. She wasn't scheduled. She wasn't prepared. She wasn't even dressed for recording. She had just been woken up at home, late at night, wearing pajamas, a robe, and her hair in curlers. And yet, the second she stepped into the studio, everything shifted. Merry was pregnant at the time, exhausted, but determined. She heard the track once and instantly understood what was missing. The world was shaking, the band was unraveling, and this song needed a voice that could hold all that pressure. Hers was the only one powerful enough. When the tape rolled, Merry delivered a performance so fierce it startled the entire room. Her voice cracked, soared, and tore through the atmosphere with a raw, emotional intensity no one had prepared for. On that iconic line, "It's just a shot away," her voice fractured in a way that wasn't planned. It was a wound opening in real time. The band stared at her, stunned. Keith later said he felt chills surge through him. Mick described it as a moment where the song took control. By the final take, the energy in the room was almost unbearable, beautiful, terrifying, transcendent. Merry wasn't just singing, she was releasing something heavy, something every person in that studio felt but couldn't name. And with that, Gimme Shelter found its soul. But the truth behind her performance carried a darker weight, one whispered for decades. For years, the story of Merry Clayton's performance carried a shadow that refused to fade. Fans whispered about it. Biographers tiptoed around it. Even people close to the band hesitated to talk openly. And it all came from one haunting rumor, the idea that Merry left something of herself in that recording room, something she would never recover. Not long after the session, stories emerged claiming that the emotional and physical strain of that midnight performance took a devastating toll on her. Some said she collapsed after leaving the studio. Others claimed she suffered complications connected to her pregnancy shortly after. The most persistent version of the rumor suggested that the intensity of her performance cost her far more than anyone knew. To this day, nothing has been medically confirmed, but the silence around the topic only fueled the myth. Fans argued that no human voice could break open like Merry's without consequence. Musicians said they'd never heard anything so powerful and never would again. Keith, when asked, always responded in a strangely reverent tone, as if acknowledging that what Merry delivered that night came from a place beyond music. He never denied the rumors. He never confirmed them either, and maybe that's why the story still lingers. In Gimme Shelter, her voice doesn't feel sung. It feels torn from the center of something fragile and sacred. But Merry's performance wasn't the only part of the song born from danger. Keith's famous line, "No other band could match this," had a deeper meaning than anyone realized. People often assumed Keith Richards was talking about musicianship when he said no other band could match Gimme Shelter. But Keith never cared much about perfect playing. What he meant was something far more unsettling. To him, the song wasn't impressive because of technique. It was terrifying because of context. It came from a moment in history, and a moment in the band, that simply couldn't be recreated. Keith believed the Stones were living on a razor's edge in a way that other bands weren't. Their lives were chaotic, their inner circle unstable, and the world outside felt like it was burning. The music wasn't crafted from theory or studio precision. It was carved out of fear, instinct, and emotional exhaustion. Other bands, Keith once said, didn't live through what we lived through. And that was the point. Gimme Shelter wasn't written. It happened. It was the sound of a band absorbing the world's panic and channeling it through a single, fragile, explosive song. Every element came from pressure. Keith alone during the storm. Mick writing lyrics about violence disguised as prophecy. Merry Clayton pouring her strength into a performance that shook the studio. Keith didn't think others were incapable. He thought others were unwilling to step into that darkness, to touch that danger, to bleed for a song the way everyone involved bled that night. And if the recording session was proof of that energy, the weeks that followed became a chilling confirmation. Just months after the song was recorded, the Rolling Stones walked into a nightmare that felt like Gimme Shelter come to life. Altamont Speedway, a free concert meant to mirror Woodstock, but with none of its peace and all of its chaos amplified to the extreme. The atmosphere was volatile from the start, bad planning, rising tempers, and the misguided decision to hire a notorious biker gang as security. From the moment the Stones arrived, Mick could feel the tension rising like static. The crowd wasn't calm, it was restless, agitated, unpredictable. People pushed forward, fights erupted, and bottles flew through the air. Something was building, something the band couldn't control. And then, as the music played, violence broke out right in front of them. A young concert-goer lost his life in the chaos, captured on film and burned into music history. It was the moment the 60s officially ended, not with a celebration, but with a tragedy. Keith later said that Altamont felt like watching the energy of Gimme Shelter escape the studio and take shape in the real world. The prophecy inside the song had materialized. The danger wasn't metaphor anymore. It was standing at the edge of the stage, looking back at them. For many fans, Gimme Shelter transformed that day from a song about chaos to a warning that had gone unheeded. But even after living through Altamont, the story of the song refused to settle. Its legacy kept growing, and so did its power. More than 50 years after its release, Gimme Shelter still feels like an open wound. Most songs from the late 60s age into nostalgia, but not this one. This track continues to echo with something raw and unsettling, something that refuses to soften with time. Musicians admire it, critics dissect it, and fans return to it when the world feels unstable, because Gimme Shelter captures a kind of fear that never really disappears. Keith has described the song as a moment caught in amber, but it isn't a peaceful amber. It's the kind that traps a scream inside it. Every listen reminds people that the world can tilt sideways in a heartbeat, and that's exactly why the song feels eternal. Merry Clayton's fractured note still sends chills down listeners' spines. Mick's lyrics still feel like headlines ripped from today. And Keith's riff, simple yet ominously perfect, still feels like a storm rolling in from a distance. Even filmmakers caught on to its power. Over the decades, the song became a kind of cultural alarm bell, appearing in major films whenever directors wanted to signal danger, corruption, or a moment when the ground was shifting beneath the characters' feet. People don't just hear Gimme Shelter, they feel it. And that's why Keith's statement rings true, not as arrogance, but as an observation. No other band has captured fear so precisely, so honestly, or so beautifully. But the most emotional part of the story comes from someone who paid the highest price for her part in it, Merry Clayton. And it's her truth that brings the heart of this tale into focus. For decades, people talked about Merry Clayton's performance as if it belonged to myth. But behind the power of her voice, there was a human being, a woman who carried both the triumph and the weight of that night for the rest of her life. Years later, in interviews, Merry finally revealed what she felt in that studio. She said the moment she opened her mouth to sing, she tapped into something deep, something she didn't fully understand. She remembered the exhaustion, the late hour, the surprise of being called out of bed. But most of all, she remembered the emotion. She said, "I sang it like the world depended on it." And that's exactly what people heard. Her voice didn't sound like technique, it sounded like survival. But the aftermath was complicated. The physical strain had been real, and the emotional toll even heavier. Merry spoke softly about that time, choosing her words carefully, as if still protecting the moment. And when she heard her own shattered vocal on the playback decades later, she cried not out of regret, but because she remembered the intensity that shaped it. Keith and Mick always spoke of her with reverence. Not admiration, reverence. They knew she had given something irreplaceable, something she never repeated in any other recording. And it's here, in Merry's vulnerability, that the heart of Gimme Shelter truly reveals itself. If stories like these move you, if uncovering the hidden human truth inside legendary songs feels as powerful to you as it does to us, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. Your support helps us keep these stories alive and bring more untold chapters from rock history to light. After Gimme Shelter was completed, something shifted inside the Rolling Stones. It wasn't just another track on another album. It marked a turning point, one that separated who they had been from who they were becoming. The band had always flirted with danger, but now danger felt like a companion, a shadow that walked beside their music. Keith often said that after hearing the final version, he felt both pride and unease. Pride because the band had created something undeniably powerful. Unease because it felt less like a song and more like a message he wasn't sure the world was ready to hear. Mick, too, recognized the shift. His lyrics had transformed from poetic rebellion to something sharper, more prophetic. It was as if he had channeled the collective anxiety of an entire generation. Even the band's dynamic changed. Gimme Shelter forced them to confront the cracks in their unity, but it also reminded them of what they could create when those cracks aligned. Their music grew darker, more honest, more aware of the world's fractures. Critics later called the track the Rolling Stones' warning label, the sound of a band standing at the edge of something vast and unpredictable. And perhaps that's why the song didn't just shape an album, it shaped their identity. But to understand why Keith believed no other band could match it, we need to return to where the song began. The storm, the fear, the silence before the first note. In the end, Gimme Shelter stands as something far bigger than a classic rock song. It is a moment frozen in history, a recording shaped by fear, tension, instinct, and a world teetering on disaster. Every part of it was born from circumstances no band would ever want to relive. A cultural collapse, a storm in the night, a fractured partnership, and a performance so emotionally raw it left people shaken. Keith's statement, "No other band could match this," was never arrogance. It was acknowledgement. A recognition that the song came from a perfect storm of chaos and emotion that simply can't be manufactured. You can copy chords. You can imitate production, but you cannot recreate the moment the world was falling apart and a band felt it in their bones. That is why Gimme Shelter remains unmatched. Not because the Stones were the only ones talented enough to make it, but because they were the only ones who lived through the exact darkness required to birth it. Today, the song still feels alive, still feels dangerous, still feels like a prophecy whispered over a trembling generation. It is timeless not because it comforts, but because it warns. And the truth is, Keith Richards was right. Some songs aren't written, they're survived. Gimme Shelter is one of them.